While fans are thronging theatres to watch Shah Rukh Khan's latest film Donkey, which dwells on illegal immigration, in another part of the world, there is a continent that is now making a U-turn on its immigration policy. From Europe, welcoming small boats arriving at its southern shores back in 2015-16, to the same Europe passing a law on immigration, tightening who can enter, who cannot, how many immigrants does one country allow, who pays how much, what has changed? Well, before we delve deeper into this, let me tell you what has happened. The European Union has reached an agreement on the new rules on immigration, called the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, which is proposed to come into effect next year. Whether that will happen or not, we'll have to see. Now, these new rules seek to cut down on the number of migrants and democratize the cost involved in it. Under the new proposed system, countries which are not at the border will have to choose between accepting their share of 30,000 asylum applicants or paying at least 20,000 euros per person into an EU fund, which is roughly about 18,20,000 rupees. Now, there would be a screening system under this proposed system, which will distinguish between those in need of international protection and those who do not need it. People whose asylum applications qualify as not needing protection can be prevented from entering the European Union and can be detained at the border itself, as they will be seen as a security threat. Processing of the applications would also be sped up. Now, once these proposals are formally adopted by the European Parliament and the Council, the pillars of the new Pact on Migration and Asylum will be in place. Let me also now give you some quick numbers related to this. In September this year, that is in 2023, 98,240 first-time asylum seekers applied for international protection in the European Union. The top 5 asylum seekers in the European Union have been: number 1, the Syrians, 19,220, followed by Turkish citizens, 10,200, Afghans at 9,215, Venezuelans at 5,290, and Colombians at 5,230. Unaccompanied minors who applied for asylum stood at 4,055 in September this year, and they came mostly from Syria and Afghanistan. Now, remember, European Union is on track to receive over 1 million asylum applications this year, which is the most since the continent saw a peak back in 2015-16. Now, this is about the numbers, but besides the numbers, there's also been a widening cultural gap between the locals and the immigrants. Case in point, the recent riots in France, where more voices took a hardline stance against immigration and blamed immigrants not only for the violence that took place, but also for France's social problems. So this by far has been the latest situation when we talk about immigration in the European continent. Let's get more perspective on this on the broadcast. I'm joined by Dr. Swasti Rao, Associate Fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute. And I'm also joined by Mr. Anil Trigunayat, former ambassador. Good evening, namaskar. Thank you to both of you for joining us on Miror Now. I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Trigunayat. Do you think Europe has, been too late in probably formulating its policies on immigration? We've had their leaders being blamed of a botched up immigration policy. We're now seeing a widening gap between the locals and those who've come from outside and have settled in their countries. Do you think the European continent is now doing something too late and the damage has already been done, or there is still time left?
Well, I would look at it that the illegal immigration does remain a major challenge for the Europeans for quite some time now. I remember from my days in Libya and since then that Italy and other countries, Malta, and they have been having a spate of people from Africa and from Middle East, the poorer countries like Tunisia and others, trying to go across into these countries for better life, so to say, or to avoid the problems at home that they've been facing, because more and more countries in African continent have been destabilized. So this has been a major problem. But because of the kind of irregular migration that has been taking place, and time and again there have been amnesties, regular migration also. You mentioned about Syria. In fact, I remember that the Syrians, large number of Syrians were actually legally brought in also, while Turkey also was using it as some kind of a leeway against the Europeans to extract some mileage out of it. But many of the countries in the West wanted them to come and be assimilated, and they did try that. But now their politics in these countries is also changing a great deal. And we must see that more and more rightist, anti immigrant political parties are emerging, be it from Italy, Netherlands, and some other countries. And they are also reflected in the kind of policies that have been brought about as far as the migration is concerned. Now, it'll, of course,
Hmm.
resources are always a major problem. Who's going to foot for what? Because the border countries or the maritime countries from where most of these um, migrants come in. And now those are the countries that bear the biggest brunt of the illegal immigration, so to say. And therefore, what
Hmm.
happens in the process is that the other countries need to pay up also. So this particular agreement apparently is looking at apportioning the responsibility across the European Union. You have seen what happened to UK. They worked with the
Hmm.
Rwanda, that kind of a deal. Now we have seen France just this week passed very hardened immigration laws. Now, so there are several factors that are driving these initiatives on their part. But as long as they can have some kind of a
Yeah.
transparent system, which will be humane in nature, because the people who are fleeing away from various countries and coming to Europe for greener pastures are frankly need to be given a better, because they're really losing everything on the way if you see their plight. But last year, as we have seen, about more than 300,000 migrants tried to seek asylum in these countries. And now many of them
Hmm.
have been sent back also. A lot of them die on the way. So it is a very dire situation. And I
Yeah.
hope they have a very humanitarian kind of an approach and a regularized way in which whether their requests are accepted or not, or they are returned to their own countries or wherever. I mean, at least for the migrants and refugees, there should be proper guidelines, and hopefully that will be accepted and be planned, which should be vetted by various civil society groups that are engaged in this matter, like
Hmm.
the Amnesty International and
Hmm.
others.
Yeah. Dr. Swasti Rao, can we also attribute this whole situation of how Europe is reacting to its immigrants to the fact that we're all living in a post-pandemic world where economies are struggling to come back, and Europe itself has been dealing with stagnant economies for a long time. It's got an aging population, and therefore there was once a point in time where Europe was welcoming foreign hands, was welcoming foreign workers to come and contribute to its economy. But now probably that has changed, and when every time economies suffer, the locals, of course, will have a stand against those who've come from outside and taken up their jobs and their resources.
Hmm. Good evening to you, Shreya. Good evening to Ambassador Trigunayat. And I think the migration issue and the way Europe is handling it is not really understood well in other parts of the world, also in India, because I think it's a fairly complicated thing. And I think it needs to be put into perspective. Often, what happens is that this, as Ambassador Trigunayat was just telling you, that there is a humanitarian cause behind it. Of course, you expect the European societies to do something about it. There is a lot of expectation that has come from this new legislation that European Union seems to be very proud of, and is and has been touting as as a game changer of sorts. But I think we need to sort of look at it more fundamentally and need to put certain things into perspective. And therein, I will also address the point that you made about the economic slowdown and what happened after COVID. Just to put things into perspective, and I think it is for everybody to know that Europe, of course, regards that seeking an seeking asylum is a fundamental human right that is attributed to all human beings. But just by, somebody who is there to seek asylum, they don't become refugee. Of course, for that, there is a particular process, or there's a particular procedure. And now the problem or the mess that you see in Europe today happens because the European law, the common asylum law, was never really prepared to handle the influx that they started to get after the Arab Spring. And when Arab Spring turned to Arab Winter and people started to leave, and I was just seeing that you showed in your initial teaser as well that most of these migrants are coming from Turkey and Syria. So, of course, and especially Syria and Afghanistan, I'm sorry. So, you know that this is in direct relation with what happened in those societies. Now, just to tell you the more important thing, Shreya, and also to the viewers, is that the mess that you see in Europe today, can be understood in two ways. One is that there is a kind of a failure on the part of legislation. So what you just said, that of course there'll be people coming, and of course these people travel to Europe in very dire circumstances. What happens is that they come in a very desperate manner. Many a times, in fact, most of the times, the problem makers, or the group, that comes in the largest numbers, they actually burn their papers, not just their papers, but they also burn their fingers so that their fingerprints cannot be taken, so that they can never be deported. And these are the kind of complications that European Union has been handling, as a bloc. That's one. The other complication that they've been handling is also something that Ambassador pointed out, which is that countries that are the first point of contact land up sharing the disproportionately higher burden of those people coming, from across the Mediterranean. That's the second one. And the third thing is that the European Union has been aware of the fact that they need to come up with some sort of solution, because of course, on the one hand, they need these migrants. Some of these are skilled laborers. You look at a country like France, you look at, cities like Brussels, of course, you see that the migrants make up so much of this, of the workforce. But having said that, the problem doesn't come from there. The problem comes from the fact that then with them, because there is such long period of waiting, because the decisions can't be taken over them, because, governments keep changing, and then certain governments come who don't want to let them in. Because of that, you reach a level of social unrest, which often then cascades into things of violence that you saw last month happening in Dublin, and then why countries like Netherlands, etc., Sweden, Poland, Hungary have literally closed down on immigrants, right? So just to reduce that wait time is one of the solutions that this particular pact comes up with. I'm not very sure it is going to work very smoothly, because like I've said earlier, on your show, is that European Union has been coming up with lots and lots of, I would say, reforms of their original asylum law. But I think the problem, and the biggest problem right here is that there is a provision where a certain country can pay certain amount of money, and that's 20,000 euros per head, to actually buy themselves out of the situation, because right now it is a headache, and this is one of the ways in which the right-wing parties are making such huge electoral wins. So it then runs the risks of the richer European societies actually buying themselves out of this problem, and then the not so richer societies of the European spectrum perhaps having to, accommodate these people. So having said that,
which is what, Italy and Greece keep complaining about, that they have to bear the brunt of the cost when the migrants actually originally want to go to Germany and Sweden. And Italy and Greece keep complaining of the fact that we have to bear the cost of the migrants coming in. But apart from that, Ambassador Trigunayat, one of the larger issues here is also the fact that we are seeing now on the streets of Europe, where you can see a clearly widening gap between how locals think and how the immigrants think. Because of which the question arises, when you move into a foreign country, do you live by their rules, their cultural system, and leave behind yours? How does that work? And that is perhaps the biggest bone of contention which is coming right now, and adding more fuel to the existing fire that already is there in European continent, the conflict between the outsider and the local.
Well, I mean, that is the paradox that these people have to live with. On the one hand, they develop this ghetto mentality, and they want to stay within the groups. If you go to New York City, you will see the little Italy, little India, or a China I mean, they're very much their part of it, irrespective of the fact that where are you coming from, you get together and you want to grow up together. So that very much happens there because you suddenly overnight cannot adapt to the local government or local system, local mores, local culture. It takes time to get there. And that happens over the years and depends on the level of prosperity and achievements that you have. And that is very clearly evident if you see even the Indian diaspora in the United States, for example, which has the largest numbers now. So it is normal thing. It is always a little problem. But at the same time, we have seen one of the worst thing that happens is occasionally because of certain issues a lot of radicalization takes place. Sometimes some incidents happens and then they try to completely mark that particular community and uh, I mean then you have these kind of disaffection that is taking place in the society. So I think that this is something that is a problem that every country faces. On the other hand, there is one more thing one must not forget is that most of these countries in Europe and United States, they are essentially, graying countries. There, they will require manpower, they will require skilled manpower, but they are not looking to get this kind of immigrants who are coming in there, so they want to screen them properly. So I think to that extent, it is quite legitimate as long as it does not become inhuman. Because very often we have seen it that
Mm,
they try to give citizenship or entry permissions to a certain country in order to create some kind of from a political, I would say, egregious political objective against that some other countries. It has
mm,
happened there in these. They play it as a geopolitical tool also sometimes, like we are seeing in the case of various Sikhs who are in Canada or the US or in European countries. So that is done on purpose. It is not something that happened
mm.
automatically. So there are these kind of issues are also there for all kind of countries, and then there are empty instances on this particular score. So I personally believe that if the Europeans and they supposedly call themselves as upholding human rights and all democracy and whatnot, so if they are able to follow that, I mean, not only that, you look at this
Mm.
in the European Union also, when Poland was becoming it one of the members of the European Union,
Yeah.
the rest of the British and the others, Polish, the plumber will take over our country, and those kind of things were heard. So it is not only from the
Mm,
people coming from these countries, developing countries, or the countries which are currently going through a violent disruptions in society, but also most of the another thing
mm,
you should also not forget that many of these countries are also erstwhile colonial powers. They have exploited these countries and they continue to do
mm,
so even now in Africa and elsewhere. So people naturally look up to those countries to
mm,
go there and reap the same benefits. So I think that this is a very complex situation,
mm,
as
mm.
Dr. Swati also said. I mean, it needs to be looked into. No simple ruling can resolve all the issues that are there because the humans are at the core of it.
Hmm. Dr. Swasti Rao, you know what's interesting is that today the same Europe that had criticized India when we came out with CAA, they'd taken out resolution after resolution in the European Parliament where they spoke against CAA and India trying to make its way through and, formulate some guidelines when it comes to the immigration policy or the refugee policy. It's the same Europe that is now tightening its own laws regarding immigrants. Uh, but in terms of India, how does how should one be paving her way through this sort of situation? We've got the Tibetan refugees, we have certain laws, but in the near future, how should we be moving about this kind of a situation?
Well, Shreya, so I think the first understanding needs to consolidate around the fact that it is a fairly complex situation, not just in Europe but everywhere else. In Europe, it becomes all the more complicated because let's understand, and I think it's very clear that they are an aging society. They are not really having children anymore. They are dependent on all these laborers that are coming from different countries. But then, because of the legislative, so to say, deadlocks or gaps, they are having to face these these problems that we mentioned. And just before I come to India, let me also add a few things. That one of the reasons why there is so much expectation from this particular reform in the common asylum law, let there be no confusion that the common asylum law has been reformed several times in last decade. Originally, what the European Union had was called the Dublin Regulation. And the Dublin Regulation, if you were to Google that, Dublin Regulation was all about how to handle refugees and asylum seekers, etc. And it was really quite, the pitch and the tone of the Dublin Regulation was quite idealistic. And that idealism came from the fact that the European project is based on, these neoliberal policies that believes in human rights and democracies, etc. We understand today that it's become really idealistic and I would say, palatable in current circumstances, as the right wing is really winning the elections left, right, and center. And one of the reasons why even presidents like Emmanuel Macron, who are supposed to be left of the center, are actually coming up with a new migration pact is because they do not want to lose this war of optics when it comes to managing European societies to the right wing. So in many ways, you saw that Marine Le Pen, that represents the far right in France, would say that it's like Macron who's doing her work. So, I mean, the interesting bit that I want to tell you is that in Europe, the nature of the problem is a little different from what you would find in other parts of the world. And the other thing, just before quickly coming to India, the one reason why this particular reform is going to work while the previous ones have not worked, even though they also have talked about the different types of quota systems, so that let there be an equitable burden sharing between all 27 member states. But this one is particularly going to work, not only because of the fact that it gives the European member states an option to buy themselves out, but also this is the first time they have assigned a certain number to each to each member state, which is about 30,000 people. Now, I still don't know what do they plan to do with people who actually burn all their papers so that they are never deported, or with those who actually burn their fingers so that there is no trace. Eurostat, I mean, that is where you would find the European statistics. There is a within that particular framework, you also have a particular platform or portfolio of all the fingerprints, which is the largest fingerprints record in the world. And their problem is that you can't get the fingerprints of these people because they burn them, because they just don't want to go back. And that is what, like I said, we've been discussing, that leads to all the waiting period, and because the authorities don't know what to do with them. And ultimately, after years of sometimes waiting, they are sometimes turned back, and it becomes a bigger mess. So, like I'm saying, is that I don't have very high expectations of this particular law, but it does sound better than its previous avatars. And number two, I genuinely see in Europe now, also in the centrist parties across Europe, a genuine...
So I think it's a tightrope, Dr. Swasti Rao, that the world has to walk. As you say, that the nations, the boundaries, the geographical boundaries were made for a certain reason. There were limited resources, but of course, there's also a humanitarian angle that the world has to see, and we'll have to see how not just Europe, but the entire world moves through this kind of a situation. We leave it there. Ambassador Trigunayat and Dr. Swasti Rao, thank you very much to both of you for joining us tonight and sharing your perspective on this new proposal in Europe on tighter immigration policy. With that, we're slipping into a short break. News and updates will continue on the other side. Stay tuned to Miror Now.